Hey there guys, and welcome to this new video on creating a custom React data table. And in this video I'm going to show you guys how to implement the column functionality, that's hiding and showing of columns. And that's actually this icon over here. So on click of this icon we have this drop down with all the columns in a data table, and you can actually hide or show any column you want to on a data table. So you can hide the ID, show, hide the name, hide the matrical, hide the age, and all of that. So let's head straight to the code and see how that's implemented. So if we come to this header over here, so this is actually a table header. We have this column view icon over here. So if we follow that icon, you see that icon is practically just all of these jars. But before coming to the icon in itself, let's head over and start explaining chronologically from the columns itself, because we're dealing with hiding and showing of columns. So that has, well, a great deal of stuff to do with our columns array. So initially in our data table, we have just the columns for all the different columns in our data table. So I have the ID, the name, the magical, the age, and all of that. So we now have this new array over here called adjusted columns. And what we are doing is we're adding a new column to our columns array. And this column is for actually the actions column. That's the column for our icons. That's the edit and delete. So if you see over here, we have all these columns level, but we don't have the column for our actions, and actually that column is being added over here. Now we have these columns to display variable over here. So in addition to all the different properties, that's the key and the component, we want to add a new field inside each entry, and that field is going to be a select field. So this field tells us if that column is being displayed or not. So if the field is true, then what we want to do is we want to display that column on the data table. But if the field is false, then we want to, well, not, we don't want to display that column on the data table. So we are taking these columns, for the columns to display, we are mapping through this adjusted columns array, and for each entry in that array, that's for each column, we are keeping all the other fields constant, and that's we're just destructuring them. Then we're adding a new field of select, and we're setting that to true, meaning initially we want all columns to be visible on our data table. So if you come down here, we have some new states. Well, the states actually start over here. So we have this table column state, and what this table column state does is it keeps track of all the columns we have on our data table, including this select field. So this select field now can be true or false, and depending on if it's true or false, we are going to have that on our menu, because we'll click over here. For example, let's say we hide this column. You see the column does not show on the data table, but we have that column here in this menu, and in this menu that column is either checked or unchecked depending on if the column is displaying or not. Meaning here on our data table, the column does not display, but here in our menu, we still have that column displaying, except the check field for that column is, well, unchecked. And all the columns here in this menu are kept track by that table column state we have over here. So the table column state keeps track of all the columns on our data table, whereas the table columns displaying state keeps track of all the columns currently displaying on the data table. So here is for the columns on the data table, careless of if they are displaying or not, whereas here is for the columns displaying. That's only for the columns displaying. So that's the use of these two states, and we have a couple of states and function over here, and actually these are just for drop down menu. So with all of that out of the way, we are going to come down to column view icon and see what happens when we click on that icon button. So the first thing that happens when we click on that button is we have this icon. So we'll click on this icon, which is actually in this button. What we want to do is we want to open this menu. So after this menu is opened, we practically just have this menu item with a form group in it. So in this form group, we are mapping through all the table columns because as we said, the table columns keeps track of all the columns on our data table, careless of if the select field is false or true. So we are mapping through these table columns, and for each column or for each entry in this table columns array, what we are doing is we want to display a checkbox, and that checkbox, the checked field of that checkbox or the check attribute is going to be the column dot selected. So this column dot selected, depending on if it's false or true, this checkbox is going to be checked or unchecked. So if the false field is, if the check field or if the select field is true, the checkbox is going to be checked. But if the select field is false, the checkbox is going to be unchecked. And also, this checkbox has a name, and that name is simply equals to, well, the key of that column. So if we hover over here, we see each table column entry has a key, and that's the key over here. And we're going to give that key as the name of this column. So on click of any entry or any checkbox, what we want to do is we want to call this function. And what does this function do? If I climb or if I hover up to this function, we have this handle change column checkbox. So on click of any checkbox, what we want to do is, well, we're going to ignore all these console logs. So what we want to do is we want to have this new constant, and what this constant does is it goes through all the columns in our table columns array, and what we are doing is we want to check for the name. So where the key of that column is equals to the name of that checkbox, we want to change the select value of that checkbox. So we go through all the columns in our table columns array, and when we locate the checkbox for which we want, or when we locate the checkbox for which we clicked on in our table columns array, we practically want to change the value of the select field. Meaning if the select field was true, then we want to change that to false. Well, if it was false, we want to change that to true. So after doing all of that, we want to set the table columns to be these new table columns we are from creating. So that's actually going to help us to know which column is now checked and which column is unchecked in our drop down. And what we want to do is we want to call this new function again. And what this function does is it simply sets our table columns displaying. And as we said, this table columns displaying state is actually the columns going to display on our data table. So after setting a particular column here, or after changing the select field of a particular column and getting those new columns in this variable, what we want to do is we are passing that variable as a parameter to this function. And what that function does is it takes all the columns we pass in as a parameter, and it filters for only the columns in which the select field is true. Meaning this state, since as is actually our columns we want to display on our data table, meaning all the select fields for each entry in this array has to be true. So we just filter all the columns for the values which select fields are true only. And if we descend to our create body t arrow, you see we are mapping through these table columns displaying state, and for each value, well, we want to produce a t arrow. And this is actually what permits us to be able to control the tables or the columns displaying on our data table and the columns which are hidden. Because for a column to display on our data table, that column has to be found inside this array. And as we saw over here, this array contains only values for which the select field is true. And that's practically it, guys, for how hiding and showing of columns is being done on our data table. So this was the old way of doing things, but as you can see, I've commented that out because this didn't give us, well, a hold of what column we are to display and what column not to display. But with this new method, as seen above, we can use this table columns displaying array to, well, control what columns we want to see on the data table and what columns we don't want to see. So that was practically it for how the hiding and showing of columns functionality was implemented. And as I said, it's a pretty great functionality. Yeah, you literally want to have that running up on your data table, and In the next video, I'm going to show you guys how to implement the resizing of columns functionality. So as you see, we can resize columns, and the functionality works pretty well with our scroll functionality, because now when we resize columns, we have the scroll bar given to us for the rest of the columns, which can be displayed on the data table anymore. So I'm going to show you guys how to get that functionality working up in the data table in the next video. So that's it, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos coming up, and see you guys in the next video.